Okay, let's get going. I want to welcome everyone to the BGSU Science Cafe. I'm Kevin McClooney. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences and the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies. I'll be your host for the evening. We have a great event tonight, but first I want to thank the Division of Research and Economic Engagement, Marketing and Brand Strategy, and WBGU for helping to make tonight possible, as well as our graduate coordinator, Kelly Bryant. Our event tonight is modeled after the International Science Cafe movement, encouraging informal conversations between scientists and the public. Thus, the talk will be short and aimed at a general audience, with about 30 minutes devoted to discussion with the speaker and the panel. Our main presenter tonight is Dr. Wendy Manning, who is the Dr. Howard E. and Penny Daum Aldrich Distinguished Professor in the Department of Sociology and the co-director of the National Center for Family and Marriage Research. Dr. Manning holds a BA, MS, and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tonight, Dr. Manning will be speaking with you about how the pandemic has affected the well-being of individuals with sexual and gender minority identities. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here today. It's a great opportunity to share some of our recent research, and very timely in that we have had some new work appear in the media, so we'll be able to feature that. I want to be sure to acknowledge the team that has been working on this with me. We have three panelists who will be joining us at the end, who are all graduate students in the sociology department: Chris Julian, Kristen Gustafson, and Ali Sherman. And they're all sociology students. There's other fabulous students in the program who are doing important work as well, so I encourage you to think about sociology if you're interested in these kinds of social problems. So how I want to start today is just tell you that, talk a little bit about changes in attitudes. And one of the fastest attitude changes that's occurred in the United States has been the acceptability of marriage for same-gender couples. And about 25 years ago, about a quarter of Americans thought it was acceptable for people of the same gender to marry one another, and that's increased to over 71%. So it's a tremendous change in attitudes. Most attitudes about family have not increased at such a rapid rate. And you can see with those shaded bars are the number of states that had legalized marriage for same-gender couples. And so you can see as those states increased, so did attitudes. And what aligns with this is, of course, the passage of marriage equality in 2015 with the Obergefell v. Hodges decision by the Supreme Court. And of course, this has an Ohio-based connection in terms of Jim Obergefell and John Arthur were a couple who had been married in Maryland, and their marriage was not recognized in the state of Ohio, and this was brought forward to the Supreme Court and resulted in the Supreme Court decision. And so we've had in the last 7 years marriage equality, but we still have a lot of questions about sexual and gender minorities that we haven't been able to address in research, largely due to data restrictions. And we are fortunate that we recently had some of our research hit several news outlets. And so here's one in The Hill. This is LGBT voting bloc set to make up almost 1 in 5 voters by 2040. We had another headline in Politico: report projects major growth in LGBT voters in coming decades. And in Forbes magazine, 1 in 7 eligible voters could be LGBTQ by 2030, and also in the New York Daily News. So we've seen a lot of press on our research, and so it gives us an opportunity to explain to you how we came up with some of the findings and how do we do this work. And I think why it's important, there's many reasons why this work is important. We want to support the health and well-being of all Americans and all people. But I thought Joni Madison, the interim president of the Human Rights Campaign, had said this well. She said the LGBTQ plus voting bloc has been steadily growing and is on track to exponentially expand in the coming years, becoming one of the fastest growing voting constituencies in the country, wielding increasing influence in local, state, and federal elections. And so this is very timely in terms of midterm elections that are coming up right now, as well as a lot of changes in the rights and support for LGBT plus Q population in the United States. So I think our research partners were the Human Rights Campaign. They were curious about the projections of the population. As demographers, we were able to answer some of these questions. And so if you want to know what the exact numbers are that are beyond the headlines, in the US in 2020, about 11% or 10.8% of the population would identify as LGBTQ+. And in 2020, we estimate it'll be approaching 1 in 5, as the headline said, or 17.8%. And if you're curious about Ohio, Ohio mimics the rest of the nation in that 9.5% in 2020 of the adult population identify as LGBTQ+, and that will increase to about 17.7%. And so what I want to share with you today is some of the science behind the numbers. We as social scientists are often left out of some work because they don't think of us as scientists, but we actually are, in that we are people who are testing research questions. We have hypotheses, we're using appropriate data, and we're using rigorous methods to answer our research questions. So we're happy to be part and included in the Science Cafe today. And we want to share with you what is some of the science behind the numbers. We're often treating data. A lot of Americans think all data are equal, and we're here to tell you that not all data are equal, and there are a lot of differences, and we need to understand more about how data are collected to understand what's going on in terms of trends and well-being for all populations. And today we'll be focusing on people who identify as sexual minority. So one of the important questions I'll talk about are the reliability of sources, sample sizes, who we ask, how we ask people, relying on administrative data, and then some of our efforts in using targeted samples. And so we talk about reliable sources. We're usually trying to identify who's collecting the data, and are these nonpartisan groups. So we're trying to find answers to questions that don't have a bias behind them, and people who are focusing on perhaps nationally representative, it doesn't have to be, but population-based samples. And so a group that is known for that is Gallup. They've been around since 1935, collecting a lot of data about political polls. And they are one of the groups that's been tracking the LGBTQ plus population in the United States. And so they have a very large panel that they draw upon to come up with these estimates that's population representative. And if you look at the 2021, you can see about 7% of the population, according to their estimates, is identifying as LGBTQ plus. And so that is an important group to keep in mind as we're trying to understand population level data. But other groups are now catching up with Gallup, and the US Census Bureau has included questions that allow us to identify same gender and different gender questions. Those of you who filled out the decennial census might recall this question about how you're related to the head of household, and we can differentiate between opposite sex and same sex couples, those who are cohabiting and those who are married. These questions were included also in one of the largest data collections, the American Community Survey, and we can see when we look at, we see that there's over 1 million same-sex couples. They're pretty evenly divided between married and cohabiting, where if you look at different sex couples, you can see that a larger share, almost all of them, are married. That has a lot to do with the age distribution, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A portion of the presentation. But there's also other large surveys that are conducted by the Census Bureau and that include questions about sexual identity. A new one that was initiated during the pandemic and one that we relied upon for our analysis is the Household Pulse Survey. This survey was initiated to try to understand how the population was responding to the pandemic, so they were able to quickly release data to help inform public health policies and questions. And so using these data, about 8% of the population is identifying as LGBT. So one of the hallmarks of what we do is we try to benchmark across different data sets to understand whether our estimates are accurate or not. And so we might argue that our estimates are on par with that of Gallup using the Census Bureau data. There's also other federal data sources that collect information on sexual identity and gender identity of individuals, including the National Health Statistics and many others. So you want to think about who we're using, who's collecting the data. So the federal government is an important source of data. Another source of data, another important issue is that we need to have large samples, and we want to have large random samples. And so I just showed you that about 7% of the population is identifying as LGBT. And so if I interviewed 100 people, only 7 would be LGBT. And so you might say, well, that's not enough people to really make general conclusions, especially if I'm interested in differences according to some characteristics such as age. If I interviewed 1,000 people, I would only find 70 LGBTQ plus identifying individuals in my sample. I'd have to interview 10,000 people to find 700 LGBTQ plus, and you can see the numbers just keep growing. And this is important, especially if you're trying to come up with state level estimates, or estimates that might differentiate by gender identity, or estimates that might differ by age group or education level. And so you can see how these larger samples are really important in how, in this kind of analysis, especially when you're focusing on a small population. So not only does it matter how many people you interview in order to study small populations, relatively small populations, but it's also important who you ask. And so I can say there's 100 people, but am I asking 100 people who are all on a college campus, or 100 people who are all living in the community? And I would come up with different estimates. And so some of our research that we did for that, that's reported, that's part of our projections that was in the media outlets, is this idea about different generations are reporting, are more or less likely to identify as LGBTQ+. And so Gen Z, it's about 27% of that cohort are identifying as LGBTQ+, in contrast to only 7.6% of Gen X, and only about 5% of baby boomers. And so if I was doing a survey of baby boomers, you could see only 5% would have an identity, a sexual minority identity, whereas if I was interviewing a sample of young adults today, about 1 in 4 would have a sexual minority identity. And so that's really important why this is a growing population, because younger people are more often hold this identity, and as the population ages, they will represent a larger share of the population. And as I said, we try to benchmark this with other data. So if we look at Gallup, we see similar generational divide in terms of who's identifying as LGBTQ, and so that also gives us confidence in our estimates as we move forward. Also part of our science is thinking about how you ask questions, what questions you ask really matter. So sometimes when we first started studying some of these topics, we'd ask people just simply a more simple question like, do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? People might just give a yes or no answer to that. But in more recent surveys, people are asking a lot of detailed questions about which of the following do you consider yourself to be? And so you would offer a lot of different options, because people are more likely to respond affirmatively when they see themselves in the response categories. And another feature of this is we also included a select all that apply, because people of course have multiple identities. They might not just carry one identity, or and might have more than 1, 3, or 4 identities. And so it's important as we move forward to have this more inclusive kind of language in our work. And similarly, this has been discussed in terms of gender identity that I have listed on the slide, and happy to discuss more as we move forward. An example of this is we compared our more detailed measure that has a select all and has all the different categories of that you can identify with a fuller range. Not every category, we didn't think of them all. and when we compare them to the more simple, just yes, no LGBT question. And you can see that the LGBT question does a pretty good job when you look at people who identify as straight or heterosexual, that blue mark, that share, shows you that simple dichotomous or bivariate indicator works pretty well, as 95% of those folks are indeed identifying as straight or heterosexual in our more detailed measure. And also similarly for people who identify as gay or lesbian, that very simple measure works pretty well, because most of those people respond affirmatively to the very simple question. But people who have bisexual identities or other identities such as queer, pansexual, omnisexual, or multiple identities, those folks do not fit well into that simple LGBT question. And so how we ask a question is really going to determine how many people we report are part of different groups. And we see similar distinctions when we think about gender, as well as gender identity, as well as sexual identity. And so we are moving forward with some of this work and are exploring other ways of asking questions about sexual identity. Another way that we can study different populations is by using administrative data. And what administrative data are things like maybe hospital records or school records or tax records that people aren't answering a survey, but they already exist, and we're accumulating those data and analyzing them. And so at our center, we've done a lot of work with this when it comes to studying marriage and divorce. We've used our county level and state level data on this. And we did this to analyze changes in marriage during the pandemic. And we saw an overall decline in the number of marriages that occurred during the pandemic. Those are the light blue lines. And some states had an increase, but most of the states had a decrease in marriage during the pandemic. And we were able to use, for about over a dozen states, we have information on the gender composition of the couple who got married. And so we can determine whether the same decline in marriage occurred for same gender as different gender couples. And this chart might be a little tricky to understand, but the horizontal line there at the 1 point means there would be no change. The dots that are above means there were higher levels than before the pandemic. And the lines that are and the dots that are below that horizontal line are that there are lower levels of marriage following the pandemic. And what you can see is that the gold lines or the light lines are the numbers of marriages for those who are of same gender couples, and the solid darker lines are those for different gender couples. And so most of the decline that occurred in marriage occurred for different sex or different gender couples, and those declines were smaller than were observed among same gender couples. So that the pandemic had a different effect on marriage rates for same gender and different gender couples. Another way of studying populations during the pandemic and in general, not just during the pandemic, is to think about targeted samples. So trying to focus your research maybe on people who are participating in pride events, or people who are reaching out to certain health clinics, or people who are part of different advocacy groups or student groups. And so you can see there are select groups of people that you could study and try to understand well-being and the mechanisms for well-being. And those are very helpful and informative, but they don't tell us what's happening for the overall population. And so what we did is we used kind of a hybrid model for a research, NIH-funded research project, where we drew on the Gallup panel, which includes over 100,000 people, and we oversampled, or we interviewed more people who had sexual minority identities than those who were heterosexual. And as a result, our sample was almost evenly divided between those who identified as heterosexual and those who identified as sexual minority. And that allowed us to have an ample sample size to actually do some more rigorous analysis and multivariate analysis of people who identify as LGBTQ+. And so this is what we're calling the National Couples Health and Time Use Study. We interviewed people between September 2020 and April 2021. It was inclusive. We used that non-heterosexist inclusive language with multiple identities. People had to be cohabiting or married at the time, so our sample was limited to couples. And we included oversamples of not only those with sexual minority identities, but also those who identify as Asian, Black, and Latino or Hispanic. And so this provides a broader sample, and we didn't have to resort to interviewing 1 million people to have a large sample size. And so these data are publicly available, so we're very excited about this. If you're interested in doing research on this topic, we encourage you to download the data. You just have to Google NChat, and I think it will come up. But if you have questions, I'm happy to help you. We interviewed not only respondents, but about how they were faring during their pandemic, but also their partners and spouses. We included time diary data to see how people were spending their time and how they felt about the time they were spending. We have contextual data in the file that indicates how people were, that indicates characteristics of where people are living, such as maybe the levels of COVID that are in their communities, or other indicators of the share of the population who are identifying as LGBTQ+. So we have these and also political indicators. And then we also have, we collected dried blood spot data from people, so we can do assays to determine biomarkers, so we could get at factors that are under the skin, as well as understanding people's attitudes and views. So it's a big project with many components, but today we thought we'd share with you 5 sets of outcomes that we've managed to complete so far that tell you how folks are doing during the pandemic. And so we'll just end with some of those results. I'll move through them a little quickly, but I hope if you have questions, we can answer them during the Q&A. So our first idea here was to think about what kinds of emotional support are people receiving during the pandemic. People may be receiving support from family, from friends, or their partners. And here we're showing you, I'll show you a series of graphs where we identify people. We have people's sexual identity, and on the furthest left will be exclusively heterosexual. The next category will be people who identify as gay or lesbian. The next category are people who identify as bisexual plus another identity of pansexual, omnisexual, or queer. And the final are people who have another identity or multiple identities. And so what the stars mean are whether there's statistically significant differences from heterosexuals. And basically, if you look at this graph, when we look at family support, we see that those with sexual minority identities have lower levels of family support. They report higher levels of friend support and similar levels of partner support, so there's no difference. So there's sort of a mix of family and friend support for sexual minority people in this sample. When we look at indicators of health discrimination, and this is all during the pandemic, have they experienced health discrimination, been treated unfairly? The respondents who identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual report higher levels of health discrimination, which is especially problematic during a major public health crisis. We asked people about their coping strategies, and so we have questions about, were you drinking to help cope with the pandemic? And we see that those who identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual are more likely to report drinking to help cope with the stress of the pandemic. Our next slide focuses on COVID-19 stress related to worries or concerns that you or a family member has COVID. And we can see that those who are sexual minority, those who have sexual minority identities indicate higher levels of COVID-related stress. And then the final outcome we consider here is just, how did COVID disrupt your life? And we can see that those who are exclusively heterosexual identities have lower levels of life disruption than those with sexual and gender diverse identities. And so some of our next steps are really to focus on more resilience and positive coping. Some of our next steps are our goal is to really consider variation among sexual minorities. We've kind of grouped a lot of people together, and we can talk more about some of our more refined analyses if people have have questions. So I really appreciate your attention to this topic, and thank you very much, and look forward to hear what your questions are, and looking forward to bringing in our team of students who helped do all of this fabulous research.
Thanks so much, Wendy. That was wonderful, very interesting. A little concerning, but also very interesting. Next, we'll have questions and discussion by our panel. If you would like to ask a question, please type your question in a chat to me, and I will ask the question for you. But first, Wendy, can you please introduce your panelists?
Sure, I'm happy to introduce our panelists. I'm very pleased. These are all graduate students in the sociology department, as I said. Chris Julian is on my upper right screen. I don't know if he's on yours. Do you want to wave, Chris, so they can see you? Chris just finished his master's thesis recently. He's a PhD student in our program, and he was a co-author on the Human Rights Campaign report that you heard about at the start, and he was really the lead analyst on that. So he was dealing with a data set over 1 million respondents, so that was very impressive. Allie Sherman is next. Do you want to wave? Allie is, she's working on her master's thesis, and she's focusing on her master's thesis using these data about fertility intentions of folks based on their relationship satisfaction, and focusing on same gender and different gender couples. And she was involved in the project where we were focusing on the different kinds of ways of identifying people and asking questions, and what that means in terms of our estimates of LGBTQ population. And then finally, Kristen Gustafson has been working with the NCHAT with me, the data set. So she's been involved in all those graphs at the end. She was working on those. Her master's thesis was the first set of graphs I showed about social support differentials, and she's pursuing a new project that's examining how those social support differentials determine depression, anxiety, and loneliness among individuals who identify as LGBT. And she's involved in many of these other papers. So I'm going to give them all the hard questions, and I'll take the easy ones.
Wonderful, thank you. Welcome to the panelists. So next, I think we'll start with my traditional first question that I like to ask at these things. Give people a little time to put their questions in the chat, and then I'll go to them. I've got a bunch of questions too, but the first one is for everybody on the panel, and just it's kind of a curiosity thing. What got you interested in sociology? And also, how about family demography?
I'll start and give them a chance to think. So I got my degree quite some time ago. So when I was doing research on family demography, cohabitation was a big deal. There wasn't a lot of research on that topic, and at the time, about 40% of the population had ever cohabited. Now it's over close to 70% have ever lived together before marriage. And before marriage equality, cohabitation was the only option in most states for people who were same-gender couples who wanted to be together. They didn't have an option to legalize their marriage, and so I was involved in an amicus brief with the Supreme Court to study the well-being of children and bring together the research on the well-being of children who were raised in same-sex parent families. And so that was my introduction to this topic. Chris, do you want to go next?
Yeah, a lot of my research focuses on the LGBTQ plus community and then aging. I would say what drew me to these two specific areas is kind of like what Wendy already talked about. Was it's a really understudied area in family demography. I would say most of the research focuses on heterosexual families, and there's also a skewness towards younger populations too in terms of family demography research. In an attempt to try and expand the type of research that's being done on in family demography, I wanted to focus in on the aging population, and particularly the LGBT plus community.
Allie, do you want to share your thought? I don't know their answers to these questions, so it's interesting for me too.
Yeah, So I fell into sociology because I had a professor in undergrad who was a graduate of this program, Dr. Ron Belanda, and
he was a student of mine.
so he's a mentor and a friend now. I just fell in love with sociology through taking his classes, and I've always been interested in fertility, and especially with new reproductive technologies and assisted reproductive technologies. It's very growing area, and there's not a lot of research on sexual gender minority individuals with their fertility. And so now we have NCHAT, and I'm able to use that data to look at these populations. So that is how I really fell into this area.
And Kristen?
I'm trying to think of how to shorten my answer. I have so much. Yeah, I really fell in love with it. I just took an intro class and I was kind of looking for a new major because I realized I didn't like the major that I had before. And I had a professor that kind of just took me under his wing and was like, hey, do you want to write a paper? And I got to present it at a conference. And I was like, hey, this is really cool. And then I also found out how understudied like same-sex families. And I read a lot of Wendy's work in undergrad, not even knowing who she was and how like this research was starting. And I was raised by a same-sex couple, so I was like, wow, people are studying like me. And yeah, it became the thing I couldn't not do.
So we all have a lot of passion for these topics, and we just can nerd out about it all day long. So
That's wonderful. I love that. But I love hearing all the different stories about how everybody got interested in what kind of science they do. So that's great. I think we can go to the chat. First question here. Do you find that there are occasional situations in which a respected survey source generates results substantively different from the majority of other sources?
I would say that's certainly possible, depending on some of the characteristics and qualities that I described about different data sets. So if a data set is focusing mainly on only very young people, I might draw different conclusions about social life and well-being than I would if I was focusing maybe on an older population. So I think that's where some of Chris's work coming in is challenging some of our research that's focused largely on young populations. And so it's certainly possible. We try to uncover why and think about some explanations for why that may occur. It could be how they're asking their questions. It could be they have a very small sample size, but there's something usually valuable we learn from all of these studies, and they're part of when we are writing our papers that we use as it's what we try to do in our literature review, is be a guide and share with others, like here are these series of papers and here's what they found and here's what we can draw from them, and try to use that to propel our work forward. So we integrate it.
Sounds good. Okay, so let's see, here's the next one. Hopefully I understand this. So might it be that lower support from families is directly related to stress during COVID, especially when we are cloistered? Like, is that I think the way to think about that is, did COVID like reduce the support from families?
Right, that's a question that I think is really important, and that with these data are cross-sectional. We're striving to collect longitudinal data, and we're trying to write a grant right now to keep following up these respondents and see what happens. So we don't know what the levels of family support were prior to the pandemic, so we can't really speak to how the pandemic caused changes in support. And I would say that's a shortcoming of this, but there's very few longitudinal data collections. Just to give a quick shout out to another project I'm involved in that has pre-pandemic and pandemic measures, and it's very interesting to see that some people, a lot of people fared worse during the pandemic, but some people did fare better. And so I think it's important to think about change and continuity in these. So I think that's an excellent question, and we can try to answer that maybe by asking retrospectively about their perspectives of change in family support. And so that kind of project would be really well received. But at the moment, we don't know if it's the pandemic or people's sexual identities that are causing these levels of family support. But the levels we observed during the pandemic are consistent with what we would observe, that have been observed in other studies prior to the pandemic. So there has always been kind of a gap. Of course, some people receive a lot of support from their families, but others, on average, folks don't. And some of that could be why others are receiving, people who have sexual minority identities are receiving a lot of friend support, is in a way to replace that lack of family support. And then there's also, as Kristen would tell you, there's also, well, I can let you want to talk about it a little, Kristen?
I was just gonna jump in and say that we did, like, in just existing literature, that sexual minority people have historically had lower support from family, and replace that with friend support and like the chosen family literature. We don't have, like, we can't do the causal with COVID. As Wendy said, it's cross-sectional. And then we didn't find much difference between, like, different sexual minority identities. So, like, gay and lesbian versus bisexual and pansexual, etc. in that. But
I think the families, chosen families, is a term that's used quite often, and I think an important one for those who are lacking family support. They might replace that with a chosen family, which could be friend, which we didn't have specific questions about that. So,
future research area.
yes, so much to do. It's what makes it so exciting.
Great. Next question is about if we can use these data, and if so, how to help support undergraduate and graduate students.
Certainly, I think they can be. We did not target college students, so we think that, of course, but we do have enough people. If you wanted to study young adults, you could do that. We don't know if they're currently enrolled in school or not, so it couldn't be helpful for that kind of question. I do think there are probably, when I mentioned targeted samples, there probably are a number of studies that are done of college students, partly because they're, for researchers, they're pretty easy to locate. They're right outside our offices, so you can try to do surveys and study them. I serve on the IRB, and I've seen a number of studies come through that are focused on college students, so I imagine there's many out there with that sample. And they have certainly high levels of stress, undergraduate and graduate students, as they're trying to pursue education. Certainly that's been well documented and of concern.
Anyone else have thoughts about that, or?
They have their own personal stress and working through the COVID, as anybody I think will tell you. And all of these students were enrolled in our program during the pandemic, and so especially I think Kristen and Chris started their graduate studies at the. They had been. You guys started in 2020, right? Or 2019?
Our recruitment weekend was the last normal weekend.
Yeah.
It was March 6th through 9th of 2020. We all got home, and then everything shut down, and then we started that August. So.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a few more questions for you. Some of them are kind of like wading in the weeds a little bit, but maybe that's okay.
We love the weeds. Bring on the weeds.
I noticed that Idaho was an outlier in that marriage during the pandemic situation. Like, what was going on there?
Okay, Chris, Chris is the first author on this. It's published as a data visualization in a journal called Socius. So,
it's an outlier on both fronts, I believe. I believe it's we're not very clear about what happened for that particular state. Obviously, you see in that graph, Hawaii also stands out as a clear outlier in terms of like experiencing pretty high decline. We attribute that to be travel restrictions that because Hawaii is a destination state for a lot of couples going there for marriages, they experience a substantial decline. But obviously and this is, I had to double check that number several times to make sure it was actually that high that was happening for same-sex couples. It could be, there has been a recent population increase for Idaho. It has been a destination spot primarily for wealthier couples, but we're not sure what to attribute it for just same-sex marriages that has seen such a substantial increase. We don't really look at Idaho as being a destination spot in terms of, so why it's happening during the COVID pandemic is beyond me.
I'll throw out a wacky idea. Maybe you heard about people from New York moving to other locations because their jobs were virtual. I don't know, just wacky idea.
It could be a lot of people from California moving to Idaho to escape that, but I imagine it might be. I don't know if it would be more selective of one group than another. So that's what it's kind of a mystery. Maybe we need to take a field trip to Idaho and figure it out.
Awesome. Sounds good. So I've got another question from the chat. Do you have any idea of why LGBTQ individuals perceived more life change from COVID, perhaps related to having a less insular group of close family rather than nuclear family, of chosen family rather than nuclear family?
Yeah, I think there were probably a number of reasons why a number of LGBTQ plus individuals work in industries that might have been disrupted during the pandemic. So they might have suffered economically or in terms of the number of hours they were working or their schedules. There's also additional stress maybe related to those individuals who have children and maybe not feeling as much support from the community for their families during the pandemic, and also maybe not receiving support from the community as well as their families could be tied to those higher levels of how the pandemic disrupted their lives. But certainly if people feel as if they're not receiving as many levels of legal supports, that too could be threatening to your well-being. So those are all certainly hypotheses.
Yeah, good points. I know, just obviously personal anecdote, but I felt like I definitely had a little more support and interaction with some of my family members during the pandemic than I do normally. So yeah, I could see that as being a bit different.
Yeah, and individuals whose families might not be supportive might be forced to return to their parents' home, especially when we're thinking about young adults. So they might not have that safety net, or if they do, they might feel that they can't be their authentic selves with family members. So I think that can play an important role.
That's a good point. Okay, so let's see, another question. Let's see if I can summarize this. If as you project the percentage identifying as LGBTQ will increase from 10 to 20% plus, can we project that the LGBTQ community will be large enough that bias discrimination will disappear? And do we have any experience with other minorities and societal acceptance and how things have changed?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think there could be opportunities for lower levels of discrimination and stressors if that growth in the population would mean that there were more supportive policies. So I think that's something that's sort of oddly happening. We had support for marriage equality through the Supreme Court that's being threatened somewhat. And even though more and more people are identifying as LGBTQ and more voting age people are, it seems as if in some places there might be a backlash, and they're rolling back rights and legal protections that have been offered. And so I think that's something to consider. I would like to think that as a population and a minority group grows, that there would be a more general acceptance. But I think that always can be viewed as threatening to some groups as well, and so they could be a reversal and even more policies. So I like the optimistic view, and I would like to support that, but I'm not 100% confident that that will be true moving forward. And so, and as you can tell, there's going to be a lot of variation according to states. It's not going to be the same across the whole U.S., so we have a lot of state variation in policies. And I think those are we're going to see those come through. But generally, you would think that places that have greater levels of a greater share of the population identifies as LGBTQ+, you'd have more positive policies. But for example, Texas has a pretty large LGBTQ+ population, but their state level policies are not very supportive. So sorry, Kristen, to pick on Texas, but yes. And so they're not perfectly aligned that way. We already know that. But it's a great question and an important idea to consider in future work as we try to understand social and policy climates.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll throw out another question, which I just curious a little bit more about the blood spot analysis. What are you trying to figure out with that?
Well, they're trying to. It's one thing to collect the data, but it's sort of another thing to analyze the data and link them to different biomarkers. And so you could, and so there's a team of. So we've managed to collect data, but now we need some federal funding to actually analyze it. It's more expensive than you think to store and analyze the blood spots. I didn't think. I wasn't trained in this field, so I've just been learning more about it. But there's a fair amount of research in social science that are asking biomarker data that include these sort of biomarker measures, and they're trying to distinguish between sort of what's under the skin and what are social factors and how those two interact. So individuals who are raised in for example, might be raised in neighborhoods that have greater disadvantage, might exhibit higher levels of cortisol and experience greater levels of stress that's detected not only in surveys but also when we analyze this kind of data. So I think there's an opportunity to. I don't think we're trying to say there's a biological basis to differences, but just are they exhibited differently for those individuals who are experiencing more stress in their lives? And so we've seen this in different analysis of different minority groups, and so they're trying to extend this to study sexual minority people as well. And they haven't been included. There have been very few studies that have included them in biomarker analysis. So there's. And I feel nervous talking about this in front of a biologist, of course.
Well, I'm not a hardcore physiologist, but I know some folks that are studying stress hormones in birds in cities. So it's really, really interesting to hear you say that. Yeah. Seems like there could be a lot of interesting parallels there.
Yes, that environment will determine how these hormones exhibit themselves or other indicators exhibit themselves, definitely.
Yeah, very cool. Let's see. I'm gonna sort of. I don't know if it's a question so much as a poorly formed thought, but Ali, I know you were talking a little bit about you're going to be investigating fertility issues. I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, and I just think that's an interesting idea. I know, dealing with infertility is very stressful, and trying to get fertility treatments is. Got to have a lot of face-to-face time with a lot of doctors. So doing that in a pandemic, I can only imagine. So I was wondering if you could just say something about that.
Yeah, so the infertility is something that I'm very interested in, but right now the area that I'm focusing on is fertility intentions. So looking at factors that are related to couples and the timing of when they're deciding to have children during the pandemic, because our data are situated within the pandemic. So if people are intending to have children within the next year, or unsure when they're going to be intending to have children, or if they just are not intending children at all. And then I'm looking primarily at relationship factors that are associated with that. So looking at relationship satisfaction and relationship conflict and sexual satisfaction, and how that all incorporates into fertility intentions, specifically looking at same-gendered and different-gendered couples and if they operate the same with that. So eventually, I would love to look at infertility and different assisted fertility techniques, and how that can play into that. But for now, with the data that we have, I'm focusing on intentions.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah, cool. So I think we'll end with my question I like to ask, and this could be of everyone. If you could give one piece of advice to aspiring students, what would it be? We have some students in the audience, so that, you know, if they're interested in doing this sort of work, what would the advice be?
Let's see. Well, how about I have the students start with their answers, and then I'll wrap up with some things. So does somebody want to jump in? This group has been very open. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're interested in it, send us an email. Let's go.
We're teaming with a large group of people. So the NCHAT, the data are collected with a colleague of mine who's at University of Minnesota, who was at Ohio State. So we have weekly NCHAT meetings where a number of Bowling Green students, including Kristen, Chris, and Allie, as well as postdocs and faculty members at Ohio State and Minnesota, are part of a group. And so I think that's given them some additional insights, I think, into this. Allie,
We work with a lot of former students too.
Yes.
We reached out because we have a conference. We had a conference deadline a few weeks ago, and Wendy knew what some of her former students were interested in that NCHAT had. So we reached out, and I got on a couple papers that way where I was just running the numbers and making their tables and charts for them, and they were kind of writing because it was their specialization area. So it was really fun.
Chris or Allie?
I would say that I encourage anyone to get into this research, because I think, like has already been hinted at, there's just so much room for research. Chances are, I mean, it's a very understudied area. I think when you look at the family demography area in general, and especially if you use population level data, a lot of the samples for this area focus on convenience, small samples. So now that we have NCHAT data available and some of these other federal surveys that are now asking sexual and gender identity questions, there's just so much research to be done.
Yeah. Allie, do you have a thought or two?
I would just add on to what Chris and Kristen are saying, just say sociology in general. We cover a wide breadth of topics, and there's a lot of different areas that you can situate yourself within. So if you're interested in it, really check it out, because there's a lot that you can do with it, and it's very, very cool.
Since I'm teaching biometry right now, I'll ask, you know, how it sounds like you all use statistics a lot, right? So that's got to be a key thing for a student who's interested, right, to go do that kind of classwork, right?
I think it's good training. I think also, though, I've been involved in analysis of narrative data and qualitative data, which also is a very important piece to many of these questions. So I wouldn't say exclusively a quantitative focus, but I think being skilled in both is very helpful. And I think if you're curious, you should really reach out, and we'll be happy to answer questions and read literature on the topic. So there's a lot of research on these questions, and so we have to move beyond some of our common sense or our own experience models and observe what's happening in the broader literature. So reading widely is very helpful, because we're not only reading sociologists, we're following people who are health equity scholars and people who are studying public health and psychology, economics. So there's it's a very interdisciplinary field, so that's helpful too.
That's wonderful. I'm excited.
Good.
Maybe you'll get an email from me.
Good.
But anyway, thanks everyone. This was a great discussion. I want to thank everyone for coming. Please keep an eye open for announcements about future Science Cafe speakers. And just thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.